So I was excited to find out today that there's a new medieval movie coming to cinemas later this year about the Peasants Revolt of 1381, starring Andrew Garfield, called The Uprising. And regular viewers of this channel will know that whenever I see a medieval movie or historical movie that's on the way, I always look at the costumes, the weapons, the armour, and I think, oh no, what are they going to get totally wrong this time, I always ask myself. And one of the obvious things that I think they're probably going to get wrong in any movie about the Peasants' Revolt is what weapons the peasants are actually going to be using in this case. And in fact, so far we haven't seen a trailer, but we can see already in the promotional poster, we can see Andrew Garfield has something like a sickle tucked into his belt. And indeed, most people tend to assume that agricultural tools like sickles and billhooks and flails, or even hammers and things like this, kind of everyday kind of items, are going to be the principal weapons of a peasant army. But was that actually the case? And are they going to get this movie horribly wrong? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Welcome to the Peasant edition. So very often on this channel we're often looking at like knightly weapons like swords or fancy types of armour. But of course most people, overwhelmingly in the medieval period, were farmers. The vast majority of people were farming the land in medieval countries across Europe. And there were many peasant revolts or peasant uprisings. It was something that the landed gentry, or indeed people in towns and cities, the mercantile sort of middle classes, if we call them that, were constantly afraid of, because of course the common people were far more numerous. We could go back to the Roman era, BC, and we could look at Spartacus's uprisings, which made hugely exploited the fact that there was a massive slave population in Italy at the time. And of course he particularly drew upon, once the gladiators themselves had risen up, he drew upon essentially shepherds, the people who lived up in the mountains, herded cattle and sheep and goats, and they were incredibly effective soldiers, in fact, and very good at fighting in mountainous regions where regular Roman armies weren't necessarily that good. So this is something which goes back way into antiquity, but the fact is there were numerous kind of peasant uprisings. We'll unpack the term peasant in a second, in the medieval period in many different countries, but one which has got a lot of historical attention, certainly in the Anglo sphere over the years, is the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. But that being said, I don't recall it ever being featured in a movie before. Now obviously we can't criticise the movie yet because we don't know anything, we don't even have a trailer to go on. Based purely on the poster, there are worries, there are concerns. The costume, why is he covered in mud? Why is he made to look like someone who's potentially, homeless, when Wat Tyler, as far as we know, was a tiler. He was someone with a good job. I'll come back to Wat Tyler in a second. In case you don't know who Wat Tyler was one of the leaders of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, and Andrew Garfield in the movie is supposedly playing Wat Tyler. Should he look like someone in dirty rags? Probably not. He should be wearing proper medieval clothes of the late 14th century, which would have colours. They wouldn't all be grey and brown and kind of sooty, with soot and dirt smeared all over his face. And should he be armed with a sickle? I don't particularly see why someone who is reputed to have been a tiler should necessarily have a sickle. The funny thing is we do actually know a couple of weapons that he did have. We'll come back to that in a second. So fundamentally, did peasant armies or common people uprising armies, and you've got to bear in mind that the Peasants' Revolt wasn't just peasants, it was people of various different classes, but it seems to have been more of a rural versus urban. That is, the people primarily involved in the Peasants' Revolt seem to have come from Kent and Essex and the southeast kind of rural economy, and they essentially attacked a series of towns, cities and settlements. One of the places they ransacked was none other than the Tower of London, and they killed various royal officials, in fact. But what's interesting is this particular army, and this is true of many peasant uprising armies, didn't do very well on a battlefield against an organised army. That's a topic for another video, so I won't go into depth. But by and large, although there's one battle that was involved in the Peasants' Revolt, it wasn't really a battle, it seemed to be more of a rout. And what the Peasants' Revolt did actually was taking settlements, holding people to ransom, killing people that were unguarded, undefended, or at least not adequately defended for their massed numbers. Anyway, right, so the question is, what weapons do they have? So absolutely, it is true that peasant armies were often armed with things like this. This is essentially a sickle on a stick, but obviously variations of this. So short-handled sickles, as shown in the movie poster there with Andrew Garfield, or indeed scythes remounted so the blade was upwards instead of sideways. We see this in period art. Flails, famously in what's now Czechia, Czech Republic. The flail was a very common weapon that was used very effectively by the Bohemians. Any type of kind of tool that you can think of, just the same as in the modern world. So statistically, without any comparison, it doesn't even come close. The most dangerous weapon in the modern United Kingdom now, where the Peasants' Revolt happened, is the kitchen knife, the humble kitchen knife, because every single house in the land has a bunch of kitchen knives, and it doesn't matter what legislation they bring out about zombie knives or ninja swords or machetes or whatever. Everybody has access to kitchen knives, and if for some weird reason they don't have a kitchen knife, of course they have a screwdriver or an axe or a hammer. These sorts of things are always around us, and they always were, of course, even more so in the medieval world. So absolutely, what was to hand? Tools, agricultural tools, meat processing tools, fishing, hunting tools, all of the, even manufacturing tools, hammers and things like this. Axes for cutting down wood. Absolutely, they were always around and they were always used. However, there's some important points specifically regarding the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 that we have to bear in mind. And for England, specifically in 1381, the absolutely most important factor is archery, longbows. Okay, so the idea of giving people this sort of the tools and the agricultural implements or trade instruments, absolutely they would have been used, but longbows were omnipresent, not just because they were just common and people liked archery, but because it was literally law and had been for the best part of a century, in fact over a century. So the simple fact was that Englishmen were by law required to practice with the bow at the butts, the targets, on Sunday. And that law wasn't repealed until way later. So the fact is that they all had access to bows and arrows. So clearly if a peasant army or common people army in England revolts, their primary weapon is gonna be the bow. And moreover, if we go specifically to Wat Tyler, so there is a 16th century story about a John Tyler who was supposedly the leader. It all gets very confusing. Is this the same person as Wat Tyler? We don't know. But the story goes that so the revolts happened essentially because of tax burden. Much like today, people don't like having to pay lots of tax when they don't feel that they're getting good value for money. I won't get political, I promise. But quite simply, a tax collector, it's a common theme in English stories about Robin Hood or anything else. A baddie tax collector comes along and essentially sexually assaults John Tyler's daughter. He is a tiler, so he has access to hammers because they're used in tiling. He picks up a hammer and he kills the tax collector, and this is the sort of spark, I suppose, Braveheart-like, the spark that ignites the rebellion. Whether this has any basis in truth, we don't know. Wat Tyler, as he's recorded, who might have been called Walter Tyler, but Wat Tyler from the late 14th century, 1381, we don't know exactly where he came from, apart from the fact that he was probably a tiler. However, so he might have had a hammer, absolutely, but we know he had other things because several chronicles record that he had served as an archer in the English army in the wars with France, because of course 1381 is the middle of the 100 Years' War. You know, you've got Crécy in 1346, Poitiers in 1356. You've got a whole bunch of other small battles and skirmishes throughout the late 1400s. There's a period of peace. Some of the English form the Great Company and the White Company in Italy and rampage around Italy, earning lots of money and then bringing it back to England. Sir John Hawkwood, obviously, and all of that stuff. And then in 1415, you've got the Agincourt campaign. So this is a very warlike period where Englishmen are very much being encouraged to practice as much as possible with the longbow and to have the equipment. So the primary weapon, in my opinion, of the Peasants' Revolt would have been the bow, because everyone would have had access to it. So the question is, why isn't this recorded more in the chronicles? Why isn't their awesomeness with their archers more formidable on the battlefield and more effective? Well, here's a potential answer, and something we'll probably look in greater depth at in a future video. Arrows weren't necessarily owned by any individual in great quantities. So your typical person who practiced archery every week would probably only maybe own, you know, a dozen arrows for practice purposes. They weren't allowed to hunt with bows in most places, in most cases. They were allowed to hunt small game, but not deer and stuff, because they were owned by the king. Hence all the Robin Hood stories. So they probably wouldn't have had an awful lot of arrows, and one of the main things with war at this time, if we look at Edward III's campaigns or Henry V's campaigns, they were obsessed with getting as many arrows as possible. So to fight in a war, you need thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of arrows. That's your ammunition. It's no use having the best rifle in the world if you don't have more than one magazine of ammunition, because you're not going to last very long in a war. So it always comes down to ammunition. We'll do a deeper dive on that topic, because it's a very interesting topic, I think, in a future video. So while the Peasants Revolt undoubtedly had bows and arrows, they maybe didn't have access to a huge number of arrows, and this would have limited their use to some extent. So they would have had to rely on hand weapons. But here's a funny thing. So when Wat Tyler came and London met with royal officials and indeed Richard II, he allegedly pulled out a dagger. And this is a very important thing to notice as well, that regardless of whether someone was a farmer, a middle-class person, an upper-class person, pretty much everybody had a knife, okay? So regardless of the bigger weapons you might have, like a large stick or a spear or a sickle or a scythe or whatever, everybody would have access to knives and daggers. They were just omnipresent everywhere. So indeed, while the peasants wouldn't have had access to armour, or not much to speak of anyway, maybe the occasional gambeson or mail shirt, they wouldn't have had access to plate armour or even very much mail or, for the most part, helmets or things like this. They would have been unarmoured, so they would have been vulnerable to royal archers and the king's army, but they would have had, at the very least, longbows. They would have had agricultural tools for big weapons, long things. Anybody can make spears pretty easily. Spartacus's army way back there in the early Roman period used fire-hardened long sticks as spears initially, until they got better weapons later on. And this would have been the same in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, so they've got plenty of big weapons, and of course they've all got knives and daggers, which everybody had, as well as, you know, agricultural short things like meat cleavers and, you know, fish gutting knives and butchering knives and all this kind of stuff that was everywhere. So they wouldn't have been badly armed, even if they weren't really an army and probably not that coordinated in the way that they were led. And something else that gets overlooked as well is, of course, the Peasants' Revolt did ransack the Tower of London and various other settlements and places. So they would have, through the process, if not initially, through the process of their campaign, if we call it that, they would have acquired more swords. They probably had some swords anyway, because of course someone who'd served as an archer in the English army probably had a bow, very often would have had a sword as well. Swords by this time weren't that expensive. Most common people could afford a sword, so most maybe wouldn't think that they needed one, but they might own one. And some people in the village, you know, a handful might have swords. So there would have been some swords and other, you know, similar war hammers or axes or whatever at the beginning, and they would have gathered more through the course of the campaign. So by the end of the Peasants' Revolt, they probably would have been fairly well armed. And remember also, the Tower of London had huge stocks of arrows, so they also would have got more ammunition for their bows. So to summarise, what I suspect that this movie is going to get horribly, horribly wrong. In fact, I can pretty much bank on it. I'll bet money on it. Number one, they're going to get the costumes, the dirt, the grey, the grey haze, the smoke, the mud, all of that stuff that is medieval, as I see some people refer to it online. The cliche of the medieval period, when the reality of the medieval period is that most people didn't have mud on their face all the time. Most people wore coloured clothes, you know, bright reds, blues, yellows, greens, these sorts of colours. They weren't just walking around in grey and brown with leather, black leather, all the time. We're going to get all of those things wrong because they always get them wrong in every medieval movie that seems to have been made after about 1975. Unfortunately, maybe one day we'll get back to the glory days of the 1950s and 60s where they actually showed the medieval world as colourful, looking like the manuscripts that we can see, or indeed the surviving shields and tapestries and stuff which show how colourful and vibrant it was. But in terms of the weapons specifically, I predict they're going to show Wat Tyler as this some sort of peasant farmer with nothing but a sickle, doing some Jason Bourne stuff with sickles, which if you want to learn how to do that stuff, you can look at Paulus Hector Mayer's treatise. There are treatises showing the use of peasant weapons like flails, scythes, sickles. It's really cool stuff because obviously people had those things, and therefore people fought with those things, because just as we see in the modern world, if something exists, at some point someone will hit someone else with it. But the fact is that, yeah, peasant weapons did get used, but in the case of Wat Tyler's rebellion, or the Peasants Revolt as it's known, of 1381, they would have had longbows. Tons and tons. I'm going to grab it again to make the point. Loads of longbows. This is England, goddammit. This is England in the 14th century. Longbows were like everything. By law. You got in trouble if you didn't practice with it. So there would have been tons of longbows and obviously arrows to go with them. They would have got even more arrows when they took the Tower of London and various other settlements, or when they defeated royal forces, which didn't happen an awful lot, but some individuals, they would have got hold of this stuff, this ordnance. And they would have got more weapons like swords and good quality weapons as they went along, but they would have had anyway knives and daggers universally. So they wouldn't have been as badly equipped as I guarantee you they will be represented in this movie. Maybe I'll be wrong, and you know what, if I'm wrong, in this case, I'm happy to be wrong. I'm really happy to be wrong. I hope it's really well researched, and all of the peasants, or at least a lot of the peasants, have longbows, and as well as the scythes and the pitchforks, we also see some decent weapons which they would have got from the places that they ransacked. Anyway, I have been Matt Easton. I have been ranting for your pleasure, and I will be again soon on this channel. Make sure you're subscribed. I hope you are, and I'll see you back here really soon. Take care, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.